I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting of council to look at our Central Elgin official plan update. And I'm going to ask if any member of council have any disclosure of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, hearing none, I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Dylan Associates to walk us through. I know it's in sections, but they want it casual enough, council, that if you have a question at any point, just raise your hand and we'll acknowledge it at that point rather than waiting till we get to the end of a section. So, and Zara, I believe you're presenting.
I am. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, Mayor Martin, Deputy Mayor Marks, and members of council. I'm pleased to be with you today to talk about the Central Elgin official plan update. As an introduction, my name is Zara Jaffer. I'm a planner and engagement specialist with Dillon Consulting Limited. We're the firm that was retained by Central Elgin to work on the official plan update, on some of the policies and background studies, as well as the engagement for this project. And with me today are a couple of other colleagues from Dillon. Ron Shishido is a senior partner and policy planner with Dillon, who's been working in Central Elgin for a number of decades and is intimately familiar with the local context and policy framework, and he'll be talking a little bit about some of the background studies that are going in to inform the official plan. And Nicole Bugley, who is an engagement specialist and facilitator with Dillon, will be with us to talk a bit about some of the inputs into the official plan update associated with population growth and demographic change, and will also be helping to facilitate the discussions as we move forward. That's a little bit of the introductions. So our agenda for today is going to have a number of sections. As you mentioned, we are looking for any questions that you might have, any comments that you might have as we go through, and then we will also have a discussion component at the end. So we'll provide a project overview and just a bit of a recap regarding the scope of the official plan update and what it's about. We'll talk a little bit about the related initiatives and projects that feed into this process. We'll also talk about those key issues and opportunities and the kind of high-level overview of what is intended to be accomplished through the official plan. And we'll share a feedback summary of what we've heard from the engagement and the consultations to date. And then also talk about those elements of population growth and demographic change and the climate change projections that are a little bit of that basis and foundational element of how we approach the official plan update. And then we'll do some group discussion to get your inputs as council on providing some policy direction and providing some sense of what those key priorities are for review and consideration through this official plan review. So we'll start with the project overview and just talk a little bit about how we got here and what it's about. So the official plan is being updated to align with new provincial policy, namely the provincial policy statement, the PPS, which was updated in 2020, and the Provincial Planning Act, which was also updated in 2020, and to prepare for growth to 2046 across all of Central Elgin. So it is a 25-year time horizon that we are thinking about. It's related to all the different elements of land use planning, environmental planning, urban design, agricultural and rural policy, et cetera, and all of the elements that go into the official plan in order to think in a forward-looking way and to consider the lessons learned up until this point in time. So the project has 3 phases. We have completed phase 1, which was the project launch in the spring of 2021, where we began that review of the vision and the opportunities and challenges for growth to 2046. We are now in phase 2 of preparing the draft update. So we are looking at meetings with council and with key stakeholders to identify what those key policy directions are going to be that will then form the basis of the draft policies update the official plan, and we'll be proceeding with that over the course of the fall. And then into early next year, we will be doing the actual updating of the official plan to bring together all of those policies into an official plan amendment to be presented to Central Elgin Council for adoption and to the County of Elgin for approval. So I'll hand over to Ron Shishido from Dillon Consulting to talk a little bit about the related projects and initiatives and studies that feed into the official plan review.
Thanks, Sarah. So there's 4 key planning efforts that are underway in support of the official plan. The Port Stanley Harbor secondary plan was prepared to satisfy a policy requirement in the current Central Elgin OP, that's a 2013 OP. The secondary plan was completed in June of 2021, this year. And then OPA number 9, official plan amendment number 9, was prepared to formally incorporate the recommended planning policies and related land use designations in the Harbor secondary plan into the Central Elgin official plan, and then be the 2013 official plan. Council held a statutory public meeting under the Planning Act on August the 10th to present OPA 9 to the public. Now, there are 3 other initiatives that pertain to the updating of the official plan. And the official plan, the 2013 plan, was prepared under the 2005 PPS, and as I previously said, was minister approved in 2013. County planning came into effect after that. As Zara indicated, a new 2020 PPS is in force, and that is necessitating municipalities across the province to update their OPs to comply with the new PPS. In September of 2020, Central Elgin initiated their official plan update. Central Elgin has adopted population and housing forecasts up to the 2040 planning horizon. And that work was carried out by Watson and is documented in their study dated December 2020. Now, using those new housing forecasts, work is underway to update Central Elgin's residential land supply requirements, again, to the 2040 planning horizon. Now, based on those results, a strategy for allocating that growth will then be prepared. That growth management strategy will provide the planning policy basis for the proposed updating of the growth-related policies and land use designations in the Central Elgin official plan, as well as provide the policy basis for approval by the county. Sarah?
Sorry,
Yes?
Ron, if I could just ask a question. On the one that was sent out to us in our package, it also had Affordable Housing Workshop Group, and I'm just wondering why that's changed.
It's changed because the study was completed. I believe that was the Tim Welch study that was done in conjunction with the county and done with St. Thomas. That work was done in 2018. We were involved in that study as well. So the study is complete, and we understand from staff that the committee's mandate was completed and the committee is no longer in effect. However, that work, the reporting in that document, is also being fed into the OP update work. But I didn't include it in there because this was for more related to active studies.
Okay, I was just concerned because we never did, like the presentation was made, but we never adopted any of the recommendations specifically.
Yeah, the key, what will happen is key findings and key directions from that report would be factored into the official plan review process and the reporting that we're pulling together. And then that would be discussed with staff and then with council, and then ultimately within the context of the recommended changes to the official plan, that's where they would see the light of day. So there's many aspects for review and formal endorsement by council.
Thank you.
Zara?
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from council about any of the content shared before?
Not seeing any. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go very quickly over these major baskets of key issues and opportunities. This was what our team developed in a preliminary way prior to going out for engagement. So this was done on the basis of the policy audit and review of the Central Elgin official plan currently, in order to think about what are the areas for updating in order to come into conformity with the provincial policy statement, with the Planning Act, and as Ron mentioned, to make sure that all of these additional studies can be considered and brought into the process. So these key topics that were identified were the overall picture of planning for growth, for population and demographic change. Secondly, rural and agricultural policy. In addition, we had housing affordability, climate change, and hazard lands, and Indigenous community consultation and reconciliation. So these are all things that are touched on in the provincial policy statement. These are all things that the Planning Act addresses and identifies as being important to be included in official plans. And so we wanted to make sure that when we go out to the public, we are asking for input and thoughts and commentary on these key issues. And so we will round back to this set after we talk about what we heard from the public, and then look for council's input as well on anything that we may have not yet heard or anything that has been missed so far.
Zara, we do have one question.
Oh, great. Please go ahead.
Pauline?
Thank you. On the previous slide, you just had hazard lands called out specifically there.
Yeah.
I just was curious where sort of the wetlands fit and the woodlands fit, because they're not necessarily just hazard lands, they're kind of entities on their own.
Absolutely, yeah. So any elements of environmental policy and that type of thing does fall under the larger bracket of planning for growth. It falls under the elements of climate change. So there are environmental policies and elements associated with ecology and natural heritage that would be addressed in various different ways through all of these different brackets. But in general, in terms of the overall planning for growth, that also encompasses a wide variety of additional policies that are included in the official plan and that would need to be reviewed and considered for any updates.
That's just,
Go ahead, Colleen.
thank you. So, maybe I have a different understanding, but if the official plan is really about land use designations, those three items are sort of standalone designations in my mind, I guess. So I understand that they could fall under some of these different key policy themes, but they still are their own entities. So somehow, I was just looking at the existing official plan anyway, so it calls out and it recognizes them, but it's in a very general, very, very broad way. And I guess I'm also thinking sort of with the woodlands, the way they are in a lot of the locations are the old ash there, everything is deteriorating and they're all falling down. So without having a plan as to what that woodland land use designation should look like as related to quantity and perhaps quality, it just feels like it's an important thing to note in the official plan somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And this will definitely come up as we move into the next element of doing some deeper dives with stakeholders. So we are planning to hold meetings with conservation authorities and with the general public, particularly advocacy-related organizations, to think about environmental protection, to think about ecological protection and heritage in the context of climate change, but also in the context, as you described, of making sure that ecological heritage and its protection and its vibrancy is considered in the official plan as well. And that needs to be in conjunction with conservation authorities and their mandate as well.
Zara, maybe I can add a little bit. So Central Elgin and the predecessor municipalities have had a long history of recognizing the importance of the natural environment, recognizing the importance of natural heritage features. And as the council indicate, those are the features pertaining to the wooded areas, vegetation, birds, all those things. Hazard lands specifically relate to the flood lines and things of that nature. And some of the more specific things that we deal with KCCA on, the natural heritage issues that the municipality has dealt with through the years have been discussed both with municipality, with adjacent municipalities and the regulatory agencies at the province. An extensive amount of work has been done for each of these sub-watershed studies to look at the natural heritage functions. And someone like Tom Young, who has worked on all of these sub-watershed studies, is very familiar with the issues that the council has been talking about: the health of the woodlots, the kind of vegetation on the side slopes, and the need for protecting those key assets of the natural environment. So yes, we hear you loud and clear, and we do view the natural heritage considerations as separate from the more specific hazard land considerations.
Mr. Shipway wishes to speak.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe maybe as of yesterday, even the county council is further looking at natural heritage features as well, which ultimately informs our policies through their policies.
Yes, that's the next step, that they're doing public consultation, et cetera. They are on natural hazard, climate change, and natural heritage areas. That's the next one that our planner there is working on. One thing in your presentation as such that we were sent out, you gave a little more specific information for each of those 6 categories. So, which I found helpful, but I realize you're not doing that on this one. So.
Yes, we're going to get there. We've rearranged things a little bit because what we were hoping to do is tell you what we heard and then circle back and show you that summary of key feedback and key elements that fall into each of these themes in order to validate and confirm if anything else needs to be added. So we're hoping to kind of combine it and make it into a little bit of a discussion as well. So we'll absolutely be presenting that information as well as part of this presentation.
Thank you, Zara. That helps.
Okay, great. Okay, so we will proceed into giving you a little bit of a recap of the phase 1 or project launch related activities that we've heard. So project engagement page was set up on Let's Talk Central Elgin. We also set up a separate survey tool to take on a bit of a map survey on a tool called Social Pinpoint. And that ran from June to July. It also included a quick online poll. And then that fed into a virtual open house that we had on June 16th. In terms of the early feedback, and then the poll and the survey remained open throughout the course of July to allow for people who had attended the public meeting, as well as those who may have missed it, to be able to share their feedback. And so from the online survey, we had 81 survey responses. It was essentially a tool that allowed participants to identify something that they like, areas that they think are appropriate to grow, ideas and suggestions, as well as things that they might be concerned about, which is that yellow with the exclamation mark that you see in a few places on the map that's screenshotted in front of you. And so we were essentially trying to identify what some of those key issues and opportunities are, and to give the community an opportunity to really think about the future as well as the present, and what kinds of things we need to be considering as we plan for growth. And so the responses told us certainly that growth planning and population growth is a key consideration. It is something that a lot of the participants noted as being critical and highly important for the official plan update, followed by urban design, environment and climate change, housing, and agriculture within a very close margin. So there was certainly a good agreement on these core issues as all being of critical importance, but with growth planning being kind of paramount as well, which aligns with the general thinking and purpose around the official plan review. In terms of other key theme areas or topics that came up, we heard about water and costs related to water servicing. We heard about community development, changing community character, changing lifestyle and quality of life elements as the communities grow in Central Elgin. We heard a fair bit of feedback around the Port Stanley Harbour Secondary Plan as well, because that process was ongoing at that time. We heard a lot about affordability and about property management and ways that people want to have conversations about how growth is going to impact various elements of development and various elements of community life. So we heard about the need for community space, including green space and waterfront space. We heard about planning for complete communities, so that element of making sure that people are able to access retail and services and various other kind of elements of complete communities, including parks and public space within the areas where they also live, and infrastructure, in particular roads and water, as being key elements of how we plan for growth, and how those costs of growth may become manifest as the communities grow. We also asked a question in terms of how community members would like to participate in conversations as we move forward in this process. So we heard that online surveys were definitely a popular tool, virtual public meetings, which are planned as well as this process unfolds. Some participants also noted a desire to see a hard copy option for the surveys in the future, as well as call a planner and being able to reach someone and actually have a one-on-one conversation, and some general feeling that, you know, the more tools and the more opportunities and more channels there are available, the better, so that it can suit the convenience of as many community members as possible, given the limitations that we have right now in terms of physical distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of the comments that were placed on the map and comments that related to particular areas, we heard about concerns about the high cost of living in Central Elgin from participants in the Lyndhurst area. We heard about concerns about water rates and flooding along William Street, and making sure that policies really consider community character and how new development will support neighborhood character in Port Stanley. We also heard about the need for more parks in the development area, as well as that echo of concern about water rates. And we heard about the flexibility for lot boundary adjustments in some of the agricultural areas in New Sarum. And we heard about the desire to see publicly owned harbor lands maintained for public use and parkland, and more access and preservation of the waterfront area for public use in Port Stanley.
Yes, we have a question, Councillor Wynn.
Just relating to the last part there about the want to preserve and expand waterfront area for public use.
Mm-hmm.
Just wondering from a planning perspective, is there ever a way to look at an area like that and be able to come up with cost for green space as opposed to development? Just, and from a, like an average sort of, it's from the perspective of trying to, speak to a ratepayer, and not that I'm against green space, that's not where I'm going, but just in the want for green space, there's no revenue that comes with that. It's basically cost, whereas development and green space, a certain development can offset, right, with the revenue. So to be able to, is there any way of tracking that or showing that for a specific area? Or is that, I'm just wishing too hard?
Yeah,
I could feed into that.
Yeah.
And so the waterfront design master plan exercise that you have tendered,
Yeah.
one of the items includes municipal finance piece.
Right.
So what that is going to do is to give you a sense of what are the costs and the financial impacts on the municipality. So costs will be identified through the work that's being done for that Parks and Open Space plan, because as you know, the design master plan is for the harbor community facilities lands, the lands that have been retained by the municipality. The other thing is that there's been a lot of work done in terms of municipal impact on those lands that are designated for development, like the mixed use 1, mixed use 2 areas. So that information will be readily available for discussion.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Bill Fair here.
Go ahead, Bill.
I noticed that where it says the high cost of living in Central Elgin and regards to water rates and so on, and I see it only points to the old Lyndhurst area, which is off St. George and St. Thomas. I think it should be noted that that should be all of the Ward 4, meaning Eastwood, Old Lyndhurst, New Lyndhurst, because the Ward 4 has a little bit on the west side, but primarily the north, east, and south of St. Thomas. And again, when I talk with people, and my experience myself, because I live in the area, is that we are heavily impacted by subsidization of the rest of Central Elgin, whereas primarily our services, sewer, water, fire, water pressure, even first responders, if Central Elgin can't come in, we rely on St. Thomas, the shopping, the libraries, everything, arenas. So I think there is more than just a little concern about the cost of living and the concerns about water. Also, just recently, I did a bit of a study in a $500,000 house. The taxes were lowest in St. Thomas. Next was Southwold, and we were the highest in our area. So I think we need to have more to address the concerns of the current Ward 4 area.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. We've certainly noted those concerns. I think it's one of the limitations of the mapping tool that it only allows you to place a comment at a particular point or pinpoint versus being able to identify an overall area. So we'll certainly take that into consideration.
I'm assuming, Zara, that the comment, the Mark II listeners meant that someone in that area is the one who made that comment.
That's correct. Yes. Each of those points refers to a comment made by a participant in the survey. So these are all individual comments, but they are by no means sort of intended to be only related to a particular point destination. I think the generality of some of those concerns is certainly well noted.
Thank you.
Okay. So we had a public meeting on June 16th, which a total of 32 community members attended. The purpose of that meeting was to give an official plan update in terms of the process and to basically offer a forum for community members to ask their questions and make sure that there was good awareness and understanding of what this process is about, as well as to gather some initial feedback and comments on the overall vision for the Central Elgin official plan update. And so some of the things that we heard and comments that we received during that meeting included elements related to commercial and employment growth alongside population growth, and thinking about that element of future of work and thinking about how employment is going to play a key function in how Central Elgin plans for growth, as well as questions on how growth will be planned for as a general theme and where it will occur. So across Central Elgin, are there going to be particular pockets of the community that will be planned to grow more than others? Related to Port Stanley in particular, we did get some questions about land use and development of the secondary plan because that process is still very fresh at that time. We also got a number of questions and comments about affordable housing, a lot of concern about the lack of availability of affordable housing, as well as elements of agriculture and questions about how agricultural land is managed and potential severances and that type of thing as it is identified in provincial policy and in the official plan. And then some questions about the airport in terms of ownership and the management of the surrounding lands. So all of those were considered. Some of them are very niche issues and some of them are not related to the official plan review in terms of the entirety of the scope. So all of the comments were taken into consideration and brought forward to think about how, even if they're not completely related to the official plan, how some of those underlying concerns or comments could be considered. So I'll pause there again. Are there any other questions before we talk a little bit about some of the background elements of population?
Go ahead, Dennis.
Just that last comment that you had about the airport and the surrounding lands, was there something specific that people were looking at there? Or if you could just expand on that, please.
Yeah, it was a question, I think, just generally about whose authority management of the airport lands falls under. And the participant was just looking for more information about how the airport lands are managed in the context of broader planning and looking for some understanding of how development of those lands is planned.
Okay, was there anything like with commercial growth in that area? Was that a concern or something that we should be looking at?
It did not come up specifically associated with commercial growth, no. But we did encourage the person who put that question forward to reach out to the municipality with any additional questions or concerns they have.
I think part of it is sort of stemmed from the fact that the city of St. Thomas own the land and they have rented it out. And there is a marijuana official grow area there that they have been doing. And there were a lot of concerns with people living around that area about that and wondered what our control was as Central Elgin. But the land is entirely owned by the city of St. Thomas. And so they control the activities, the agricultural activities, which it would be quite acceptable for. So I think that was part of it because there was a lot of concern over that area.
Okay, I was actually trying to promote it as a commercial area and zone it commercially, just to use the airport as an access for a commercial hub. That's what I was thinking when I brought it up. Thank
you. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you. Jim, do you have anything else to add there?
Just a follow-up to Councillor Kravitz's comment. The City of St. Thomas did develop a master plan for the airport, which has been implemented through some zoning amendments for the airport, which do permit quite a range of uses on the airport lands themselves. Most of those uses are supportive of the airport function, but some of them go beyond just the basic airport function itself and do allow some commercial and state commercial industrial type uses out there. So If there's an interest in expanding that, the city can certainly take a look at that, but yeah, there was an effort to try to expand those uses and make the airport more viable. So if anybody on council is interested in what types of uses are permitted, I can certainly pass on that zoning amendment to council for their information.
Great, thank you, Jim. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nicole to talk a bit about the population growth and demographic changes that came out of the report that was developed by Watson and Associates in 2020. And then I will talk a little bit about some of the climate change projections for Central Elgin, and then we'll get into some discussion. So Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Zara. So as Zara mentioned, this section is meant to provide a high-level overview of the housing and demographic changes that are anticipated for Central Elgin, and this does come from the Watson study. So as you can see on the graph, Central Elgin is anticipated to grow to a population of just over 18,000 by the year 2046. And this growth will largely be the result of people moving to the area from neighboring municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And on the next slide, you'll see that over time, the youth population is anticipated to slightly decline. The 34 to 54 age group will stay about the same through that time period, and the 64 to 75 plus age groups are expected to grow significantly. And this is to the year 2046. And if you just go to the next slide, Zara, you'll see that by the year 2046, there will be almost 3,000 new households for a total of 7,700 households across the municipality. And this represents an average growth of about 92 new households per year. And so during that time, we'll also see that new housing is anticipated to continue to favor low density forms, but that over the long term, the overall share of low density housing is expected to decrease overall. And that is largely due to the aging local and regional population base, which is anticipated to result in a continued decline in the average number of people per household. And so the next slide just shows a little bit about the makeup of the housing trends in Central Elgin and what that means about some of the needs. So we see that couples without children make up about 38% of all households in Central Elgin, and that persons living alone make up 18% of all households. We also know that 89% of households in Central Elgin own their home, and that this indicates that it is a largely rural community that may lack rental housing. Households with 2 children make up 42% of households, and there is a growing number of smaller households in the municipality. And in terms of affordability, we also see that 40% of renters are spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, and that's compared to just 16% of homeowners. So what does this mean for Central Elgin? If you just go to the next slide, Sarah. Thank you. So looking forward, there is an anticipated growing need for seniors housing, affordable housing, and community and social services to support that growing base of seniors. But we also know that seniors are quite diverse in respect to their age, health, mobility, and lifestyle stage. Typically, seniors drive up the demand for higher density housing in proximity to urban amenities such as hospitals, healthcare facilities, and other community amenities. But we also know that millennials and Gen Z will play an important role in the labor supply. And Central Elgin is in a strategic place to meet some of their needs because it's an attractive place for these generations to access relatively affordable housing, local and regional employment options, the fuel costs, lifestyle preferences, and perceived quality of life in Central Elgin. And we also know that access to affordable rental housing is a need, as many renters currently spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And that affordable housing is important for attracting and maintaining that diverse workforce. Thank you, Zara.
I'm curious about one of the statistics when I realized what you said about the number of seniors and the number of single couples, the number of single people and the number of 4, that leaves 2% for more than 4 in a household or 3 in a household, which is a pretty small percent in Central Elgin.
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Deputy Mayor Marks.
Last week, I believe that the Elgin St. Thomas Home Builders hosted a forum on housing projections. Mike Moffat from the school, Ivy School, was there. And Jim, I don't know if you were there, maybe Kevin was there, I can't remember. The county of Elgin were invited. Some of their projections were quite astounding. I don't know if this has come after your projections or not, but they're saying that this is not going to slow down for a long time. And that, you know, we really need to ramp up how we can sort of accommodate the growth, you know, especially in the line of like building officials and just accommodating the growth.
Mr. Perrin?
I think it's important for council to understand that when population and housing projections are done, unfortunately, they're done with a rear view mirror looking back based on historical projections and historical growth. Historically for Central Elgin, that's probably appropriate because we're relatively, and Southwestern Ontario for that matter, we were relatively consistent with our growth rate. But over the last 3 years, like what Mr. Moffat has stated, it's on a steep incline, but there's no way of really projecting that based on any factual knowledge. We're forced to look back continually and look at historic and then revisit those population and growth projections over time. And maybe now we look at it over every 5 years. Maybe there's a need for us as a municipality to look at that more quickly, maybe once every 2 or 3 years based on historical knowledge.
Yeah, and then certainly the growth projections that were in here are quite a change from what Central Elgin has been, because we've been very stable for years. It's only in the last 3 years that we've started to grow, because we were actually shrinking at one point. We were going down. Colleen, and then, Councillor Rowe, then Councillor Wynn.
Just a comment, I guess. Yes, housing and population growth is taking off, but just some recent examples, at least in my neighborhood, of the prices that are associated with some of those housing sales. I can't for the life of me understand how those will ever be perpetuated. Otherwise, it leads to a totally different picture where people just simply cannot afford to live here at all. So you could actually see a population decline or a population demographic shift because of the sheer cost of housing. Some of it is just outrageous at this point.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I mean, the average price of a house in Central Elgin has just increased tremendously in the last couple of years.
It's insane.
Mr. Perrin? And then
I guess my comment would be, it's not just in Central Elgin, it's all across Canada. And while the prices seem like they're astronomical, the houses aren't sitting on the market for more than a week, 2 weeks. So while they might be high, there's always someone ready to move in because, and we're seeing that with people, and Mr. Moffat spoke to this, is that it's a bit of a tidal wave effect where people are selling homes in metropolitan areas and still able to purchase a home, which the local people that have been here seem like it's a high price, but it's relatively reasonable for where they came from.
yes, because of the amount they got from the sale, yes, of their house. Councillor Wynn, and then back to Deputy Mayor Marks.
Well, I was just going to say with regard to the projections and that, and I mean, we all have to remember too that something can come at us from left field and totally take us the other way again. So it's as much as we can look back and take our projections from there. Yeah, who knows what the next thing can be to hit us, and it could throw housing in the toilet. So it's, you just can't, you project and you hope for the best.
Deputy Mayor Marks.
And if I hadn't been at that forum, I would have agreed. We were kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop and, the bottom fall out.
Yeah.
They kind of kept telling us there's such a demand. They call it people wanting the house, and they just keep driving until they can afford it. Where people from, Guelph are moving to St. Mary's, moving here, wherever. And as Lloyd said, it's everywhere. So we're kind of assured that even if interest goes up, which it will, this demand in our area is not going to stop for 10, 12 years or more. And it's just kind of hard to believe, but that's again, like the demand is there, like, or you may have had 22 people trying to buy your house. To slow down, there's only 9 or 10, but the demand is still fabulous, and it's hard to believe, but, we've all lived through times where, everything just sat, but that's not going to happen around here. In some areas it may, but their best guess, he's an economist. I come away kind of shocked, and it's just like our job is going to be, we'll have to adapt to try and keep up with the demand, providing our services, inspections, etc. So it's phenomenal growth.
Any other questions or comments before we move? Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin McClure, I see you have your hand up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Martin. I just wanted to build on some of that, and I think it's one of those aspects of some of the stats that are shown on the screen, and kind of building on just some of the comments that have been made about housing affordability, and some of the, I guess, looking at those stats from previous stats about the housing forms that we've traditionally had in the municipality, and the changing of demographics. So, I mean, just on this screen that's shown right now, you can see how there is this increase in demand for apartments. There's been traditionally a lot of singles and semis. So when you have more, or an aging population where there's a desire for that more of the one floor living, there's going to be an increased need for those different types of housing forms. But with that, as soon as you now have, say, a retired, couple leaving a single attached house, moving to an apartment, that now brings a house on the market that another individual may be able to afford. Kind of, again, it's manipulating the numbers of what's on the housing supply. And then, because there are only singles, or traditionally a majority of the singles in the area are related or compared against one another, that in itself can kind of drive up the housing cost as well. So by being able to provide some better mix of different types of housing forms within the municipality, that's one of those things that could get at driving down costs within the municipality too. And it's something that we would need to look at through the OP review, and where we would like to see those different types of housing forms occur, and what our I guess projections or targets should be for those different types of housing forms throughout the municipality as well.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Wynn?
Sorry, just the multiple dwellings is getting me. So I get single and semi-detached and apartments, multiple dwellings.
Row houses?
Oh, okay. All right. I was thinking row houses as semi-detached, but okay.
Well,
Nope.
there are those, but there are the townhouse ones that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm good now. Thank you.
Hey,
Go ahead then,
Ron,
Sarah.
thank you so much, Mayor. Ron, did you have anything else you wanted to add here before we move on?
Yeah, sorry, my internet dropped, so I had to go and reboot everything to get back in. So I have I've had a number of discussions with the folks at Watson regarding the housing forecasts, and it is an interesting dynamic. I kind of picked up at the hearing, Deputy Mayor Marks, and the follow-up conversations. It kind of just reminded me, it's that as time has passed and the market in Toronto as it continues to get crazy, that it's pushed out. And you read in the paper, like Hamilton now is viewed as a hot zone in terms of being on the watch, being too hot. And my mother-in-law, who's 90 and she lives in South Windsor, her house has never been more than 120,000 in terms of the house sales for years and years and years. And now those houses on her street, they're going for 400,000. And this sudden boom, and it's buyers, it's families coming from Toronto. Like you got Toronto families moving there. And then this issue for the seniors is there's not enough one floor living accommodation in Windsor other than along the waterfront, and which is very expensive. So you're seeing the same dynamic about the issue of affordability right through the whole age demographic. But I think that for Port Stanley, I agree with the deputy mayor, the prices are not going to go down. Port Stanley is a very attractive area. Central Elgin is a very attractive area, and there's going to continue to be a push for people wanting to live outside of the GTA in these other communities that have a lot to offer, a lot of amenities.
I know, Ron, even in the last year, I mean, the houses in the small village I live in is Sparta.
Yeah.
They were traditionally from 150 to 250, most houses in the village. And in the last year, we've had one go for 600,000, another one for 850, another one for 900,000. The 900,000 one was an 1842 Georgian style cottage. So it's, and these are all people from Toronto, as you say, from that area that are moving down here that think it's a bargain and they like living in a historic house. But it's I'm afraid to see what the evaluation of our houses are going to be in Sparta soon.
Yeah, and it's very tough for your children who want to live in the community, in the area, and you want them to live in the area. They can't find a accommodation that they can afford unless we become the second bank of choice, which we're all now kind of looking at that. The Ron Bank of Canada, RBC.
I'm going to, Councillor Wynn wishes to speak.
Yeah, I agree. Can I send my kids to you, Ron? I have another question.
I've already got two that are coming to the
I
bank.
do have another question though. Is that the reason for the decline of that younger age group then out of our municipality? Is that one of the reasons for the decline then, is because of the cost of housing and the difficulty of that age group being able to attain housing here then?
My opinion, yes, that's part of the factors that are you're seeing in play.
Okay, thank you.
It looks like we had all our questions. Sarah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so we are going to talk a little bit about a different kind of forecast. This is climate change in Central Elgin. The forecast that we have extracted from is the Climate Atlas of Canada. And what this does is it gives you a little bit of the retrospective as well as the future outlook. So we picked a few of those key what we call climate hazards or climate parameters to think about how climate change is going to impact the Central Elgin as a general area. A lot of the projections do apply all over the Erie region, so this isn't entirely zoomed into Central Elgin, but it does consider some of those overall impacts, because Ontario as a whole is not going to experience all of the same impacts. There's a lot of variability all across the province in terms of what kinds of what the extent to which certain climate hazards are going to manifest. So we'll talk about this warming trend, the number of very hot days. So these are days over 30 degrees Celsius, days when you would typically need to be running the air conditioning. Between 1976 and 2005, there were a total of 8 in a 12-month calendar period. That goes up in the 2021 to 2050 time horizon to 27 days. And by 2050 to 2080, it's up to 55 days. So it has essentially tripled since 2005. And it is intended to, again, double in the 2050 to 2080 time period. In terms of winter days, these are the days that are considered below minus 15 degrees Celsius. We see a decrease in winter days. So historically, there were about 11 in a calendar year. That has gone down to about 4 for the projected for the next 30 years or so. And it goes down even further beyond 2050. And in terms of annual average temperature, you see the same trend, not as extreme, but a couple of degrees overall for the entire year as an annual average temperature. It has certainly gone up a couple of degrees since the historic period and is intended to go up again in the 2050 to 2080 period. In terms of rain and heavy precipitation and the elements that are impacting agriculture, you see a little bit of a stabilizing trend. So yes, heavy precipitation does have a significant impact on any urban environment and built up area, and infrastructure has to be built to accommodate that heavy precipitation. But the general forecast looks like the number of heavy precipitation days overall in a calendar year is only changing by a couple of days in the 2021 to 2050 period, and then in the 2050 to the 2080 period. In terms of wet days, when you might have rain or snow, again, it's very stable, both historically and into the future. You might find that those wet days congregate in certain pockets during the calendar year, so they're not as spread out. But ultimately, the overall number of wet days is expected to remain roughly the same. And in terms of agriculture growing days, which are those days which are the most amenable for different kinds of crops, there's different base degrees. So depending on what kind of crop we're talking about, some crops have a base degree of about even 4 degrees or 6 degrees Celsius. But we took a base degree of 10 degrees Celsius for the general thinking around how agriculture might be impacted in terms of the number of growing days. And again, it's relatively stable, seeing a little bit of an increase in the number of growing days into the future. And then, of course, for Port Stanley and Harborlands, you do have those elements associated with the shoreline and with uprush, and those are not captured in the Climate Atlas projections, but they are captured in the work of the ZUZEC report that went alongside the Port Stanley Harbor secondary plan. And that also identifies changes in the shoreline and the erosion zone and ways that climate change is going to impact the shoreline in Port Stanley into the future. I'll pause there if there are any questions.
Go ahead, Deputy Mayor Marks.
I'm just looking at those charts and I'm convinced you just got to look at the weather we've had in the last 6 months. There is a definite change, and I'm all for planting more trees and doing all kinds of good stewardship things. But when I look at your projections and they're based 60 years out, that's to me a wild guess. If we looked at that 3 years ago, I think we would have looked. I just, when we're looking ahead almost 60 years, that's pretty hard to guess.
But it isn't just guessing, though. They're taking it from a very scientific paper study. So this isn't just guessing. And we certainly know with the heat element that is going up. There's
no denying it.
There's no denying it. And that's what's causing a lot of the wildfires out west. And that's one big worry I have around here, because it's been really bad in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is very much the same climate we do and the same landscape.
Those projections are central Elgin.
I know, and I'm just saying that type of heat in central Elgin concerns me greatly.
Yeah, I think the point about the basis for the projections, certainly there is some degree of uncertainty, but a lot of the basis for the science shows us that those projections, when you actually work backwards from the same assumptions, are landing us quite well in terms of the overall averages across a year, and the kinds of trends that we're seeing now are well predicted by the modeling that is then being used to apply to forecasting of conditions. So there is a fair amount of reliability built into these models. Of course, there is always some uncertainty. For example, the recent heat waves and the heat dome out in BC was something that was a little bit challenging to predict in terms of its severity. So this really comes down to consideration of how we plan to adapt to climate change, how we build resilience, how we build in redundancies and capacity in the system to be able to manage both those very acute events as well as the overall trends and the overall changes in climate.
I think there's certainly definitely more extreme events that we're seeing, like, the other day, 2.5 inches of rain in half an hour in part of Central Elgin. That's a pretty extreme event for moisture. And I mean, even in the winter, for 2 winters, we've had fairly mild winters, but 3 winters ago was extremely cold and had a lot of days well below -18. So it varies, which is very hard on, orchard crops and things like that. They don't deal very well with those tremendous variances. So it's a tough one to predict entirely, but there certainly will be extreme variances in as well.
Yes, absolutely. The kind of cold snaps and freeze thaw days and that type of thing are certainly one that is a little bit harder to pinpoint and predict, as well as things like high winds and tornadoes and that type of thing. You can predict it to some extent, but there is still high uncertainty and variability in those kinds of phenomena as well.
Yeah, and they've certainly been happening in our area far more frequently. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Seeing none, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to go into the first element of the discussion. So we have these, as we mentioned, those buckets of key policy themes that were part of our initial policy audit and review of key issues for Central Elgin. And then we heard a lot that kind of helped to flesh those out a little bit. So we want to go through each of these kind of buckets, and Nicole's going to help us with taking some notes. But we just want to get an idea around Council and your perspectives on what are those key questions that we need to answer as part of this official plan review. What are those additional areas of investigation or study or review or consultation that we want to make sure are undertaken as part of this process. So we'll start with planning for growth. We know that we need to identify how much land is needed to grow. We need to identify whether the settlement boundary will need to change. We know that we need to consider how people are going to move around in Central Elgin from a mobility perspective, a transportation perspective, a public transportation perspective in the future. And we know we need to think about how do we support thriving and vibrant communities that meet the needs of community members at all stages of life. So there is this need for planning for complete communities, planning for demographic change, and thinking about individual community needs and that variability across Central Elgin as well. So I'll open it up here through you, Mayor Martin. If there are comments from council or any thoughts around these key themes, is there anything else you want to make sure that we think about when we think overarching broad level around planning for growth?
Councillor Wynn has her hand. Yep.
Well, with the first bullet point there, how much land do we need to grow? In that, are we also looking at the use for that land as well, or is that too soon? Like, if we need land for growth, what type of growth do we really need to be looking at, or what percentages with residential as opposed to commercial and light industry, which we are lacking? Is that part of that question, or does that come in somewhere else?
Certainly. Ron, would you like to start to address the question, and I can add?
Oh, okay. So how much land do we need to grow? Well, that's something that is being looked at through the residential land supply analysis. So what we're doing is we're taking the growth projections, the housing forecasts that Watson put together, and then looking at what's in the pipe, meaning your development approvals inventory, looking at how much could potentially be accommodated through intensification, and then how much can be accommodated in the current urban designated lands that you have now, right? Because what is going to happen is decisions are going to have to be made about where do you want to grow. You'll recall over the last number of official plans, and let's just relate to the last one, and Mayor Martin talked about it, that she talked about that growth, the numbers had, the growth had been slight. So in order to accommodate development in one urban community, some harmonization of designations had to be made in other areas in order to address provincial policy and get the support from MMAH, Ministry of Municipal Affairs, in terms of the where growth is going to be allocated. And I think that there's going to be some of this growth management, these growth issues are going to be discussed by staff and council once the tail of the tape, so to speak, in terms of the analysis has been done. So that's going to be an interesting conversation that is going to be had. So I think it'd be useful for council to start, councilors start thinking about where do you think growth that's coming into Central Elgin should be going, because there's going to have to be some decisions through the OP update process about that.
And so, in part of that, what type of growth?
Yeah, yes.
So we're not just thinking in terms of residential, but
No, you're not. You're thinking of
economic growth as well.
Yes, like employment growth and residential growth.
Okay, all right.
And Ron, I sat on of course, as you know, the official plan committee initially and was part of that. And I know we had an overabundance, according to all the statistics, of residential areas. And we had to cut that back some from provincial policy at the time. So we took all the small communities that were not serviced, like Sparta and Orwell and New Sarum and such, and we cut them back. We didn't have residential areas designated around them. We cut them back to what exactly exists now, because we weren't planning for growth in those areas. We were only planning where it was fully serviced. So that's why we increased Union. So we moved the supply we had in those small areas to the areas that could be serviced. And Union, it wasn't serviced at the time. It had water, but not sewage. But that we felt was doable. And these other areas were not doable for getting servicing. So I'm assuming, as I say, even at the end of all that, we still had more residential supply, supposedly for the next 20 years, than what the province thought we should have. But I think that's probably changing. That it will be interesting to see what.
Yes,
because we still do have the whole Union area. It hasn't grown yet.
Yes. And you've had a lot of activity in Port Stanley. You've had activity in Valmont. There's a lot of activity now ongoing in Lyndhurst and Talbotville area. And that the Amazon plant, once it's up and operating, that's going to attract a lot more people to the area as well.
My only concern there is, Ron, they're not high-paying jobs usually. Yes. So can they afford to live in Central Elgin and work at Amazon will be interesting. Mr. Barron.
To Mr. Shishido's point that, the council members should start thinking about the type and location of growth. It might be beneficial for council to go back and review the schedules that are in the current official plan for land use designations. There's schedules 1 and then letters A right through until J, that looks at each individual community, looks at employment lands that are currently designated in the official plan that's currently exists. So it may be beneficial for council to reacquaint themselves with those existing designations and look at where we were back in 2015 with this OP and where we're at now and what's been taken up. So it would be.
But probably to make that easier for some, and I see we've got some questions, but probably to make that easier would be maybe to have Kevin or Jim send out to council those specific things without having to do the whole, to go into the whole official plan and do the research. That's all I'm thinking. That might, if we could see those schedules, those maps, and Mr. Perrin, you can finish what you were saying.
You can send the link to the municipal website that has each one of those individual schedules denoted. That
would be very helpful. I'm just thinking rather than going back, I have the full official plan at home, but not everyone does. So Councillor Farren and Mr. McClure both have their hand up. Mr. McClure, you go ahead. You may be wanting to speak to an issue already done, and then I'll have Councillor Fair.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess to kind of build on what Mr. Perrin was saying, and kind of building on what Ron was saying as well. Essentially, I think as part of that, and the demographics component that was raised as well, as part of that, those council decisions, you're going to want to consider where those community amenities are, where those infrastructure commitments have been already kind of approved. All of that's going to be kind of part and parcel of the deliberations that are going to need to be completed in order to determine where if we do need more land, where that land should occur. Because again, if you're looking at an aging population where you need close access to certain community facilities, then that would be something that you'd want to look at as part of those official plan schedules. Those areas that may have those amenities available, they may be more attractive. Building on kind of some of the previous comments that were made by Councillor Rowe and yourself as well, just dealing with natural heritage and natural environment constraints, when taking into those considerations and protection of those features, then it's all a bit of a balancing act. So that's where hearing what is being provided today is going to help feed into that input and those recommendations that staff and that Dylan will be providing forward for council's consideration.
Thank you, Mr. McClure. I'm going to let Mr. Councillor Fair speak now.
Yes, thank you. It's this in regards to the question, do our settlement boundaries need to change? Now, settlement boundaries are fairly hard line to find, and growth in the settlement boundary general means from within, and there's substantial resistance to growth from the outside. So I'm just wondering, has the impact or whatever impact we'll have in regards to St. Thomas's growth, will that impact us? Is that what you're talking about when you say settlement boundaries? Because I'm just wondering if St. Thomas's future growth has been considered in these reviews also.
Bill, the settlement boundaries, if you look at our official plan, each, like Port Stanley has certain areas, it has a boundary all the way around it where there's certain lands that hadn't been developed yet that were designated residential or growth areas. Union has certain ones, Lyndhurst had certain ones, Belmont had certain ones. And those were the boundaries and those were the areas for growth in our official plan from 2015. That's what they were mentioning. That's what Mr. Perrin was asking that we look at. As far as the city of St. Thomas, they haven't approached us that I'm aware of, but I don't know. Mr. Shipway.
Through you, Madam Mayor. What we're talking about now is the official plan review in our settlement areas. Municipal restructuring, in that case, a boundary adjustment would be considered annexation if it's mutual, or amalgamation if it's a combination of items, but those are completely separate processes from the official plan and are dealt with under a different portion of the Municipal Act than anything we're contemplating here today.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McClure?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to kind of follow up with what Mr. Perrin was saying and just dovetail into what Councillor Fair was saying. Yeah, I was going to share my screen, but I realized I can't do that now. This on the municipality's website, they do show the official plan schedules, and what you'll note is that within the schedules themselves, there are land use schedules for each of the communities. So, Community of Belmont, Lyndhurst, Eastwood, etc. And on those schedules, they show this kind of hatched line, which would be considered what is the settlement boundary for those specific communities within the municipality of Central Elgin. So when we're talking about settlement boundary expansions, we're not talking about as the municipal restructuring or those municipal boundaries for the entire municipality of Central Elgin itself. There are certain defined areas within each of those communities that have been identified for growth, and then that's where through this process we would look at whether or not those specific boundaries of those communities would need to be adjusted to align with those growth projections and residential or other land supply that's needed through this process.
And I do like the fact that it was pointed out that we could be doing more intensified housing too. So if we put in more apartment buildings and things like that, that does allow for less use of land, more land, but it also, allows it to grow. Councillor Kravitz, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say to follow up on that, and I think that is part of the discussion as well, is that once we know or determine what that land supply and the makeup of that land supply is, it may look at that, we don't need as much land because we're going to be projecting a more intensified growth. And that it also kind of builds into some of the other discussions that we'll have later on about agricultural land supply and balancing the need to remove land from agricultural use for growth and that balancing act as well.
Yes,
Sorry,
and that to me is a very important aspect because we are very much a very strong agricultural area, and I don't want to see agricultural land disappear into housing. Councillor Kravitz, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the settlement boundary changes. I think that's something that we seriously have to look at changing. Unfortunately, we do have to take some agricultural land out and put it into a settlement area. Currently, we're out of the settlement boundary in the village of Port Stanley. That settlement boundary needs to be moved north to accommodate growth. We have the infrastructure available in our sewage treatment and our water facilities. We need to take advantage of that. And at this point, we are out of land in the Port Stanley area. We made a deal with our neighboring municipality to offer them some of our servicing. We need to take a better advantage of it ourselves. So that's one of the major areas we need to look at, changing our settlement area. The other area we really need to look at is the Belmont area. At Belmont, the urban settlement, what we approved at last council, or on the way to approving at council, the last block in Belmont is going to be absorbed as well. We're currently out of our official plan settlement area for growth. We have no more room for growth, so it's something that we need to change the settlement area wide, and it's something we need to do as soon as possible. We have to provide proof to the county that the growth needs to occur within Central Elgin. We have the infrastructure to handle it, and I think that's something that we need to start expanding our settlement areas as soon as possible. We have justification that we can provide to the province, and it's at this point we need to grow as much as we can within to look after Central Elgin. Even around the St. Thomas area, I believe their settlement area around the St. Thomas area needs to expand as well. In the Norman subdivision, even another area that we built out, allowing the last infrastructure, the last settlement area to grow there. We are currently out of growth in our area. And as I touched upon earlier, the airport area, we need to have a corridor focus there to to have some industrial commercial growth within Central Elgin. There may be some spin-off effects from the Amazon coming. We need to be prepared for the future. So yes, we definitely do need to change our settlement boundary areas, and it's something we need to do as soon as possible.
Dennis, I think you're forgetting Union. Union has a huge amount of land that is designated as residential and is not built on. Port Stanley, there's still one section left that hasn't been used. And I agree, Belmont, several areas have, but I think it's important that we follow the procedure here. Obviously, until we adopt the official plan, we can't change those residential areas. It's all part and parcel.
Yeah, but it is something that we have to do, and we should be doing as soon as possible. Just to prove to the county that Central Elgin is prepared for growth. We have to keep growing. We can't just stop and be stagnant at this point. We've reached the boundary of our settlement areas as it is in all areas.
Except Union, which has huge amount of land.
Yeah, we just took 23 acres out of it last night, and the servicing for that area, and realistically, the servicing a sewage treatment plant, a pumping station in Lawton Park, that would service the area, areas outside of the settlement area of Union. It doesn't provide servicing for the designated areas of the settlement. So there will be some restructuring that has to occur in the future. That's my feeling. Thank you.
And we didn't take that 23 acres out. We allowed one house to be built and the rest is still designated as residential land. Mr. Perrin, and then Councillor Wynn, and then Deputy Mayor Marks.
Maybe just to assist council. So right now we have the population projections in hand. What we need to do is understand, and that work is currently being done now with Central Elgin planning staff and Central Elgin staff and Dylan, to understand where our remaining supply sits. And then based on that, we can then inform council whether or not there is an oversupply of development land, realistically, or whether we need to designate further land. Let's say we need to redesignate further land for residential purposes. Then at that point in time, staff would recommend we come forward as staff and say, okay, we need X number of acres to meet our future demands. And these are the potential areas or settlement areas where the municipality and council can recommend expansion to the county, is because inevitably the county is the approval authority for the official plan. And at that point in time, council can decide where you'd like to see that growth happen, keeping in mind where there's been investment in municipal infrastructure, where there's proximity to already existing services, and that may be physical services like water and wastewater, or other services to help the residents, like social services, transit, those types of things. And then once council has that in hand, then you can make a decision for a recommendation within the official plan and then forward that on to the county. But I think the first step in this is to see where we sit based on supply.
Exactly. Thank you. Councillor Wynn, you're next.
Oh, actually, I'm good now.
You're fine?
Yeah.
Deputy Mayor Marks.
One thing, that the company Broncolini Development that bought the Ford lands are building a building out there for a tenant that has not been named. And so just, we should remember that.
They're building besides.
Well, they're building for a tenant, but they have not named the tenant. That's why they want to keep it. So the name that's premature maybe, but.
Certainly been out there.
No, I don't disagree, but that's sort of the company line. To Dennis's point, there's phenomenal growth all across the county and other places. I understand the value of farmland. However, talking to many farmers, I'm always being questioned, why are we not growing to the north? And if there is the industrial growth potential coming, and I certainly think there is, probably people are going to want to live in a house north of St. Thomas or in this area rather than Union. And I've heard from many farmers, and there's not a food shortage. I'm not, it's just like.
But with the amount of growth in Canada, there may well be a food shortage. We don't want that. But the problem with North Yarmouth is we don't have sewage and water in that area. That, like, we're not serviced in that area at this point. But that, I think Mr. Perrin's correct in that, I mean, we need to look at staff so that they can show us, you know, do we have an underabundance or an overabundance, and where would we grow if we're going to grow? What are the areas so that we can make informed decisions? Councillor Rowe.
This is a really tough one, and I honestly don't know the answer to any of these questions at all, but just to comment, there's a difference between need and want. So there's arguments on both sides of that statement. Settlement boundaries may need change, but people move to Central Elgin for a specific reason, and it's not just necessarily monetary. It's a very big part of it, but they like the open space, they like the countryside, all of those sorts of things. So I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we did not at least do an agricultural inventory, which means that we have a better understanding of what the current farmers do today. Are they growing for themselves and their own operations so that they can, you know, feed their cattle, feed their animals, feed their livestock, and then sell that type of thing? Or are they actually generating goods and products that they actually sell and put into the food stream? Because I think it would be very helpful to know if the settlement boundaries do change, which portion of those agricultural means would actually be the ones impacted. I can give you a couple of examples. They may not mean anything, but there are historical examples of places that have, let's say, eliminated all of their woodland because they needed firewood. Well, that population disappeared. That was, you know, hundreds of years ago, but things like that do happen. So it's just being cognizant of the potential impact, because you could also look at it in the total flip side. If we need to grow or want to grow, and let's say 100% of Central Elgin is urban, what does that mean? And what would that then mean for all of those urbanites in this area? How do we support them with the food supply, with all of those other things that they would need to go with that? So there is definitely a balancing act. I'm not suggesting one way or the other. I'm not pro-development. I'm not anti-development. I'm for good, proper, supportive, beneficial development.
Any other comments or questions? Mr. McClure, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Martin. Just to build on that and some of the discussion that's been occurring. I mean, the province through the provincial policy statement is pretty specific in the criteria and the processes that need to be undertaken for settlement boundary expansions. Part of that would be a comprehensive review that needs to be undertaken. I would suggest that what the municipalities currently doing now with the official plan review would be undertaking that comprehensive review, and the PPS through the section 1.1.3.8 does provide that municipalities do need to provide sufficient opportunities to accommodate growth to satisfy market demands, and that's through intensification, redevelopment within designated growth areas. And again, it goes back to accommodating the projected needs over the lifetime of the plan. So that's part of the growth projections and that we're doing right now. Some of the growth calculations that Dylan has provided in the presentation today, but also within that comprehensive review, that is looking at the infrastructure and public service facilities, so that your community facilities that are within those settlement areas, does talk about prime agricultural areas and the need to ensure that you're not compromising certain areas. You're evaluating those certain areas to ensure that you're not providing those potential impacts, which again gets into minimum distance separation, because if we do have livestock operations or there is an ability for certain uses on those agricultural parcels, that we're taking that into consideration. So I think that, I guess like the long and the short answer of it is we are going through the process right now to try to ensure that we're meeting the provincial direction on that and the criteria that needs to be met when we're looking at settlement boundary expansions and the provision of growth and development within the municipality.
Mr. Shishido, you had your hand up, and then Councillor Fair.
Yeah, just to add to what Kevin's saying, as part of the growth management review, those are specific issues that will be addressed through that review, through that analysis, and will provide the basis for discussions with council.
Thank you, Councillor Fair.
Yes, in regards to sort of follow up on the comments for Deputy Mayor Marks and Colleen and Dennis, I have had discussions with farmers, and I'm sure Councillor Marks has also, to the north of St. Thomas in regards to residential expansion going that way. And they also said that they realize that agricultural land is going to be taken out. And as far as the products produced, they said generally what they're producing is not specifically to feed Central Elgin or the area, but they said they're exporting it. And they said that just about anyone could grow beans or corn, but the residential expansion to the north makes a lot of sense. And that's the Ward 4 area also. And as far as additional facilities for waste and wastewater and so on, it would be, with the contour of the land, it would be relatively simple to expand the sewer treatment and so on and pump towards the Kettle Creek watershed. So yeah, there has been quite a bit of discussion, and these are agricultural people who are saying they are prepared and possibly, and they recognize the need for residential expansion as opposed to that particular farmland continuing as farmland. So they have already considered looking at that.
Councillor Fair, one thing that we have to think about, though, is we don't just feed, our farmers don't just feed Central Elgin. They don't just grow food for that. They grow food for Canada and our exports as well. And certainly the city of Toronto has taken up huge amounts of agricultural land and continues to do so. And I don't want to see Canada get to the point where it's totally dependent on other countries for its food. And that concerns me. But Canada, if you look at the agricultural land in Canada, Southern Ontario is most of the agricultural land in Canada. We have the West with the wheat, etc., but nothing down east much at all. The Annapolis Valley has a little. So we really are a very important part of growing other types of food here in Southern Ontario. And it's just something we need to think about. But anyway, I know this is all going to be, as Ron and such said, we will be looking at all this. We have to follow provincial policy. And I see, Jim, you have your hand up. So if you'd like to speak now, sorry. Didn't mean to go on too long.
Thank you, Mayor Martin. Just a couple of comments. As far as the land supply is concerned, Ron pointed out that we are working on that right now. But just as a reminder to council, Lloyd touched upon this. The county is the approval authority, and it's county's responsibility to allocate growth within the county. The purpose of us doing our own land supply calculation is to place ourselves strategically so that if the county does identify that there is a need for further allocation of growth within the county, that we can make the argument that we have settlement areas that are serviced with full municipal services, and that we have demand within Central Elgin for further growth. So we're trying to put ourselves in a strategic position to say to the county that if there's going to be any growth happening in Elgin County. We're well aligned because of the services that we have and because of the policies in our official plan to accommodate that growth. So that's my first point. The other point was there's been some discussion about growth amongst the settlement areas surrounding the city. Those settlement areas around the city are subject to agreements between the city and Central Elgin and to a certain degree Southwell. And those agreements specify areas to which services from the city have been extended. But those agreements don't include any areas, for example, to the north of the city boundary. And they pretty much just cover the existing settlement areas. So to expand those settlement areas, you'd have to open up those agreements again. And it may cause some consternation with the city about, the settlement areas further growing around their boundary. So just something you need to keep in mind. Council has invested some money into expanding infrastructure in some of the existing settlement areas and looking at possible servicing of Union. And so, staff, if there is any room for expansion of settlement areas, staff will certainly be bringing forward what those options are for council and recommendations as to where that approach should go.
Thank you, Mr. McClure. Zara, we'll turn it back over to you. I think we've had a fairly fulsome discussion on planning for growth, and we'll be waiting on, the various studies and reports.
Great, thank you. I think, although this is a little bit out of order, in terms of the order of topics that we were planning for, perhaps we could jump to the rural policy piece, because that is an extension of the discussions we've been having so far. We have been taking notes, so everything that you've told us that pertains to rural policy will be carried forward here. But some of the key considerations in planning for growth, some of the questions that we'll be trying to answer through this OP review process are how do we ensure agricultural and food security for our communities? And how can we support the growth of agribusiness through our planning policies? So these certainly touch on and relate to the questions that came up and the comments and the concerns that were raised. And so is there anything else, particularly when it comes to rural policy, anything that relates to agricultural policy that members of council would like to see considered or study closer through this process?
The comments or questions on this one? I know one thing we'd like to see is more, now I'm losing that term, where agricultural products are improved and sold on site, et cetera. I'm forgetting the term exactly now, but we've been encouraging
supporting business.
Pardon me?
Supporting businesses in the agri sector.
Yes, and where they do value-added products. That's what I was trying to say. And we see that a lot in various ones around here that's happening. And that's certainly, I think, an important aspect. And a lot of people living in the area like the fact that they can go to a fresh food market and get food or value-added products that they are supplying as well. And so I think that has been something we have been doing and I would continue to support. But that's only my comment. I don't know what else, if others have comments on this aspect. Go ahead, Mr. McComb.
Thank you, Mayor Martin. Yeah, Mr. McClure and I have had some discussion about the agricultural policies in the official plan. And that's one of the things as part of the review that we'll be bringing back is expansion of those policy areas to include value-added uses, and also to take a look at things like the minimum farm size that, and this will be reflected in the zoning bylaw. But perhaps some policies about minimum farm sizes. I know the Ministry of Ag and Food has tried to encourage municipalities to get away from these, minimum farm parcels. And so we have to have some discussion about that and so what maybe it should be, or if there should be a minimum or not in the zoning bylaw, and perhaps have some policies surrounding that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. Okay, are there any other thoughts or comments on this particular topic? And certainly this is not the last opportunity to provide input, but it is an opportunity just to raise any high-level concerns that might be top of mind at this point in time.
I'm not seeing any hands.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mayor Martin. So our next kind of batch of topics is associated with climate change and hazard lands, and certainly anything else that's related to ecology and natural heritage we can discuss here and include as an appropriate kind of batch of comments or topics as we move forward. But essentially in this subject area, we're thinking about how do we integrate climate change adaptation considerations into the built environment and the protection of the natural environment? How can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions as a community as we grow? And what protections from natural hazards do we need to support the longevity of our built environment? So these are kind of like the high-level conversations that we're aiming to have that are supported by additional studies, additional work, and additional consultation. Are there any other key topics of interest or areas that need to be considered under this topic?
Go ahead, Councillor Rowe.
So does Central Elgin have, might be a stupid question, Central Elgin actually have a policy statement around climate change in the official plan or planning to be in the official plan? Or is that what this is trying to get at?
Yeah, so this would be attempting to get at specific policies that address various elements of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So not only broad level climate change policies, which certainly can have a home in the official plan, but also direct policies that relate to the design of the urban environment, urban design for new public spaces, and consideration of the shoreline, for example. And so there's various areas and pockets of the official plan where climate change related policies can be included. Of course, overarching policies, but also directly related to various elements of growth and development.
Yeah, just so you know, we have an environment committee that has been working on some ideas on things that we might want to have included in the official plan. And I know, Mr. McClure, anyway, Mr. McClure, you wanted to speak, so I'll let you go ahead first.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess to kind of build on what Zara's brought forward and Councillor Rowe, there are currently policies within the official plan that do kind of get at climate change through the update to the PPS. Climate change and I guess preparing for a changing climate has now been some, I guess, new language in that I guess has been brought forward that through the policy audit we identified that there were certain policy gaps. There are certain sections within the current official plan that speak to energy, which is kind of dovetails onto the old Green Energy Act previously. There are certain aspects within infrastructure that do talk about low impact developments and other just different aspects that would kind of get at climate change. As part of this, I think we would need to update or looking to update the policy sections just to reflect the new provincial direction on climate change. But as Zara indicated as well, if there's certain things that need to be addressed or you think that need to be addressed through other policy sections because they are all interrelated, again, getting into the importance of the natural environment, again, what does climate change mean for natural hazards, and then, other aspects of, when you're dealing with development, what sort of things do you want to look at that from, taking a climate lens to that development. So I think that's where climate change, it's not just a policy section, but it's also just looking at the other sections and how can we look at those policies with a climate lens.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. Any other comments or questions on this subject?
Councillor Rowe.
Thank you. Just two comments. So as the mayor indicated, the Environment Committee does have this document that they were just trying to get their arms around. So hopefully within at the next meeting, we'll be able to kind of align on that and then pass that on to council, I suppose, for their thoughts, and maybe it will eventually make it to the planning group and to Dylan to look into things. But there's plenty of information from multiple municipalities out there that have already done so much work around this, that if it's at all possible to leverage any of that, so there's no reinvention of the wheel, I think that would be a really good approach to take. And then the second thing is hazard lands. It's just, you're saying what protections from natural hazards do we need to support the longevity of our built environment? I'm not even sure what you're trying to get at, I guess.
Erosion.
Yeah, I mean, I thought of the erosion, the dunes and those sorts of things, but it seems very limited. So I don't know if I'm missing something.
Kevin, go ahead.
So thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess Council Rowe would be familiar with this. Within the community of Port Stanley, it is the only area that does allow for development within what the province considers a two-zone floodplain. So that's, again, when you're dealing with natural hazards, it's not just the when you're dealing with like slope stability and that, you are looking at flooding hazards as well, whether or not you want to have growth and development within those flooding hazards. Now that we do have some new information on climate change models, when you're dealing with growth and intensification, do you really want to direct development and growth to those areas where there are known hazards? Because then again, it comes into the human health and safety aspects of development and long range planning. So that's where I think when you're getting into the longevity of our built environment, and that would be another aspect that you'd need to consider with respect to flooding.
Any other questions or comments on this specific one?
Yeah, just with Dennis here. With
Go
the
ahead.
with the hazard lands, with the shoreline erosion, is there anything that we could do just to protect stuff in the future in regards to potentially houses that are close to the bluffs with the erosion in that hazard land? I know we have the the 100-year limit of erosion that we deal with, but not firm that we can do to mitigate anything that happens along the shoreline as is. I don't know if the official plan can take any of that into account. I don't know. Can we add something to that effect?
Part of
Yeah,
it is-
oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Zara. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say perhaps Ron could start there, and Kevin might have something to add as well.
Okay, that was a specific issue that was addressed or looked at further by Zuzek as part of his risk assessment report. And out of that came recommendations in terms of how to address some of these issues that you talked about, like erosion, like shore uprush and things like that. So there are mitigation measures that can be recognized through the official plan, but it also involves some decisions that the municipality would have to make in terms of implementation of different things like the dunes and things like that. And this is not going to be a one-time. This is going to be these are mitigation measures that would have to be addressed over the long term. It's like everything. It's ongoing.
Mr. McComb?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Within the existing official plan, there is policy sections under natural hazards that do deal with the shoreline, specifically with Lake Erie shoreline. As part of this process, in consideration of Mr. Zuzek's report, we'd be looking to perhaps update or beef up those policies, as well as update the mapping that shows those shoreline hazards. But as far as implementation is concerned, when we finally get to the OP being adopted by council and updated, the next part of that would be taking a look at the zoning bylaw. And certainly the staff's recommendation that we consider maybe some sort of a zoning designation along the shoreline to help, give these policies a little bit more teeth, because right now, most of those areas that are within the 100-year erosion limit are found within an OS1 zone, which still permits development to occur. At the end of the day, notwithstanding the policy, the zoning bylaw is the law. And so we should maybe consider some zoning provisions to deal with the natural hazards along there. At the end of the day, we're still going to have, development that's already existing. And that's the tougher one to deal with, because you've got existing houses there. It's very difficult to take away some visual rights, and they happen to be there. So that it would be something that needs to be followed up in terms of implementation, as Ron has alluded to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to talk next about housing affordability. So this has come up certainly in the earlier discussions, and we do have the comments that were raised and concerns and issues that were raised. So at a broad level, some of these key considerations are related to what are the opportunities to support long-term housing affordability across Central Elgin, as well as how do we encourage a mix of housing types to cater to all residents as we grow. So these are kind of like the broad overarching conversations. There's certainly other elements associated with the housing supply, the type of housing that is being built, where it's being built, and various other elements that will partly be informed by the residential supply study that Ron described earlier, as well as through additional policy directions that come out of conversations with the community, with council, and through best practices and an understanding of how other municipalities are dealing with similar issues. So at a broad level, are there any other key considerations that we need to make sure we think about? Anything else that members of council would like to add to the list of issues that you see on the screen?
Deputy Mayor Marks.
I don't know if this is a place or not, but I'm often asked, we deal with farm consolidations where a house is severed and a farm is consolidated, and we've had many, and it seems to be compatible with, I very, very rarely hear where that creates a problem out in the country. Most times it's, there's a nice house built there, and to my mind, they seem to get along with. We certainly don't want to put them in close proximity to a livestock farm, but most times it seems to go, and we get residential growth, and another reason for school bus go down the road, etc. And it's a tax base as well. But quite often farmers are mentioning to me, not every farm is a square, flat 100 acres. And with the size of the agriculture equipment, we get small places here, there, and everywhere where it may be a half, 2 or 3 acres that's kind of cut off. There might be a ravine or whatever. And there's always that desire for them to build a house on it and sever it from the farm. And many times, I don't think it would hurt, but is there any consideration for that?
I believe that's provincial policy that we have to follow there, is it not?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm going to let Kevin speak to some of the provincial policy elements, and then perhaps Ron, anything else related to agricultural policy that you'd like to add there.
Thank you, Zara. Yes, the province is pretty strict in what's permitted, or I guess from agricultural severance perspective. So right now, severances are only permitted in an agricultural area for residential purposes, as the deputy mayor has indicated, if there's a residence that's surplus to a farming operation. So that would be the only way that was permitted. Other than that, I guess residential uses or agricultural uses being removed from prime agricultural lands could only be considered through the establishment of a new settlement area or a settlement boundary expansion. So yeah, the provincial policy would not support additional kind of rural lot development in the agricultural area.
ahead, Deputy Mayor Marks.
Probably the other next thing I'm reminded of is the consistency of development across the county. Whereas we've adhered to the provincial policy very closely, and then we can look across the boundary to our neighbors, and that's not happening in all cases. Development on partial services or no services. That inconsistency across the county, we're reminded of that many times, and I guess that's where this stems from. They can bend the rules, but if we allow these severances on a small lot that's not conducive to normal farming because of the size, why can't we bend the rules like in other places? And that's not me, that is things I hear.
And we are all aware, I think, of at least one municipality that bends those rules quite a bit. As I know, I've talked with Jim many times about that in the past, and that's, they've declared strip developments hamlets, which they're not. Anyway, both Ron wants to speak to this, and then Bill wants to speak. So Ron, go ahead, and then I'll have Councillor Fair.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. Over the years, Central Elgin Council has made the decision to invest in their infrastructure, their water and sewer infrastructure, and that comes, it's expensive. And as such, you also made the decision to try and direct your growth demands to those areas to best utilize those services. And that's been a consistent direction of councils, including your council, Mayor Martin. And the other thing is, if you start allowing a lot of these small lots in the rural area, then that draws away from the demand that could be allocated to these urban areas that help to pay for that infrastructure. It also draws away people from living in these urban settlements, which will also justify or increase the need for some of the softer services, for more retail, better retail, for social services in these communities. And as well, it has an impact on the viability of farmland. When you continue to allow people to be living in some of these agricultural areas. I guess I'm a little bit sensitive to that because I grew up out in BC. While I was born in Toronto, the family had a farm in the Okanagan Valley. So I have an understanding of the farm life, and also an understanding of what happens when you allow urban encroachment into those areas. So I'm always on the one side of more managed growth and looking at trying to balance it so that we can both grow and support our urban settlements, but at the same time make provision and support our agriculture in rural areas.
Thank you. Councillor Fair.
Yes, this is in regards to the housing affordability. I know you as the mayor have often brought that up about affordability, and I'm not sure if we have this or not. I know for parks, when they develop an area, they have to put aside certain amount of funds for parks. And I'm wondering if we have or could ensure that in future development, we really do have a fund set aside for affordable housing. And I know we've asked different builders to consider in certain apartments to consider some affordable housing within that. And I don't think we're getting a lot of traction on that. So I'm wondering if we could set aside in some areas that are zoned for future development and that are available already, if we could gradually build a fund for affordable housing and actually designate more areas within the expansions where they are going to be building residential anyway for some affordable housing, where there might be proof of income or some sort of a condition like that. and I don't mean to start forming a not a ghetto, but a lower quality residential area. I think that we should actively participate in some means and some method to create more affordable housing and actually really do it, not just sort of allude to it here and there, but actually build a policy that forces something like that.
Mr. Councillor Fair, that was why we had the study done, and Tim made recommendations to us that we could adopt as ways for incentives for developers to develop affordable housing. We have never actually adopted any of those. Like some of them were delaying development charges, some of them were delaying tax increases. There were a variety of things that we could do. We haven't done any of those, but that study did tell us what we could do. So Councillor Wynn, you had something you want to say.
I just wanted to follow up on that comment.
Sorry.
If I could. The one thing we have to realize that we haven't, as you said, we haven't really moved forward on that. We always have to remember that the smallest deed is worth more than the grandest intention. So I think we have to jump in somewhere and really make this happen.
I would agree. Councillor Wynn, sorry.
It's okay. Did we determine what housing affordability is and who we are actually targeting?
Yeah, the study did explain all that, the difference between social housing and affordable housing. Affordable is in a certain range within people's income, et cetera. And so that was all defined in those studies when he presented those studies to us, and how we could incentivize.
That's what I was like, have we determined, like, I know from the study, but from our perspective, have we determined what?
There are standards.
What we want to see fit into our communities with regards to affordable housing. Like, to me, and not that I'm like, I'm behind this and I want to see it, but to me, with affordable housing, like, there's just so much more that goes along with it, with terms of transportation and everything else. So I'm just, from that perspective, when we get into it, have we nailed that? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I think, I do think we need to seriously take a good look at this before this council is finished, if we can, and do something. And the other thing I know in modern subdivisions, they're now to make things better for people, where there is like where Kokomo is in Port, that you would actually have the odd small store or office or things that are there, amenities within that are all within walking distance because transportation is an issue. So, and now Port Stanley is a relatively small community, so that they can get, and it has those amenities, a lot of them. But the further we expand, the further away those amenities become. And so we really do have to look at, are there things within walking distance or bicycling distance or something, or instituting public transit?
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Shipway, and then I'll come back to you.
Well, I was just going to say, it's a quick follow-up to that, and now I may have just lost it. But I was thinking, go ahead, Mr. Shipway.
It'll come in a minute. Walking or bicycling or whatever.
To you, Madam Mayor. Obviously, this is a very important topic and big ideas will benefit us moving into the future. I just want to point out that one of the stakeholder sessions moving forward is housing affordability and growth, speaking with both the development community and those entities and organizations that are working within the affordable housing spectrum. So maybe hearing back from them on what they feel is important for us, using that to round out what council made to decide and how to move forward with some of the principles out of the affordable housing study would ensure it's grounded both in the study you've done and also currently what's going on in that realm.
Very good.
That's it. I thought of it now. Because as was said, right, like with whoever the big development is to the west of us, business wise, and with the increase in the industrial area to the north of Belmont as well too. So that's going to bring a certain need for housing, right? Like that affordable housing. So we know we've got sort of those things on the horizon that I guess that's what I'm getting to, is that we narrow that down.
Thank you. Is there anything else we want to talk about housing affordability before I have Zara go on? Does anyone need a break before we go on? I know it's been over 2 hours, so I'm just asking. Okay, everybody okay? Okay, go ahead, Zara.
Okay, thank you. So we have just 3 more kind of categories of questions here. We've got 1 more category here, and then we've got a couple of discussion questions. So thank you for bearing with us, and we're continuing to appreciate your participation here. So we're talking now about Indigenous community consultation and reconciliation. Again, this is a key part of the Provincial Policy Statement 2020. Municipalities in Ontario are required to think about how Indigenous perspectives are brought forward in all matters of land use planning, as well as how Indigenous communities are engaged and how participation is supported through planning processes. So the policies related to Indigenous engagement on planning matters and working towards reconciliation is one area for the official plan review to consider, as well as guidance on public engagement for planning matters. So as at a broader level, how public engagement is used as a mechanism as well to support reconciliation and to support overall community consultation. So those are kind of those key elements there. Any thoughts around that particular topic? Anything else that we want to consider? And I suppose it's timely with tomorrow being the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation as well. Anything that's coming to mind for members of council that you want to make sure that we consider through this process?
Anybody have any comments, questions? I'm not seeing.
For the guidance is I guess, I think the biggest thing will be looking for the guidance with it.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So the last that is the consideration of broad equity considerations. So thinking about, in particular, accessible housing, as well as thinking about barrier-free mobility. And barrier-free is a very broad kind of blanket term that includes the way that people move around. So it is related to people with disabilities. It is related to how do we think about accessibility, but it's also considering how public spaces are designed, and it is considering how building codes and, well, not necessarily building code, but the way that building design guidelines are put in place. So overall, thinking about the fact that there is going to be a significant demographic shift in Central Elgin, and how is the official plan going to be able to help support planning policy toward ensuring that the municipality remains welcoming and supportive to people across the accessibility spectrum and people with disabilities. There are, of course, other elements of equity that need to be considered. These are only the couple of ones that we heard through some of the consultations and the conversations that we've had. But certainly there are other elements of equity related to age, related to racial equity, related to various components of income as well. So is there anything else for members of council that is key, that can be very broad or high level, that you want to make sure is considered as part of the official plan policy?
I just so you know, Zara, and you may know this already, we do have a joint accessibility committee with the County of Elgin. Deputy Mayor Mark sits on that, and Mrs. Wilson is on that as well. So, I mean, we've tried very hard to make all our public spaces accessible, including our beaches, etc.
Yes, indeed. And we'll be looking at anything that can be brought forward and integrated into the policies of the official plan around that subject as well, so that it continues to be in perpetuity a key part of planning in Central Elgin.
Thank you. Anyone have any comments on this or other equity areas that you're looking for? Not seeing any more comments. Go ahead, Zara.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of the kind of theme-based or topic-based elements of the discussion. The next piece is a little bit more broad. So we have 2 questions here that encourage you to kind of cast your view 25 years out. But also thinking about Central Elgin in the way that the community functions today. So when you think about 2046, and 25 years is a long time, this is a very large time horizon to try to picture, to try to conceptualize. But what do you, as members of council, think are the biggest challenges facing Central Elgin as we grow? So we've talked about a lot of different things over the last couple of hours or so. Is there anything else that we haven't yet talked about that you really consider to be a challenge and something that needs to be thought about in the context of being addressed, solutions that need to be designed? It might be related to a particular neighborhood or a particular community, or it might be broad overall for Central Elgin as a municipality.
Thank you, Councillor Wynn.
I guess I don't know how big of a problem it will be, but I still sort of feel one of the issues with the municipality is that people who live here don't think of us as a municipality. They think of us as Port Stanley, they think of us as Belmont, they think of us as Lyndhurst. And so I find that difficult in when we are governing for a municipality. We're not governing for a community. It's the municipality as the whole. So and just because of our makeup, it's really hard to, I guess, unify us. So I don't know. I just would love to be able to see us recognized more as a municipality as a whole instead of a bunch of different communities. And part of the problem with that is I find communities tend to pit one another, like against one another, which doesn't help for governing as well either. So I don't know how you ever address that, but it would just be nice to have something that we become more Central Elgin than 5 wards.
Mm-hmm.
I think the forced amalgamation has left some people who've been around since that time, et cetera, feeling, oh, well, they get something and we don't, or vice versa. And we've tried very hard to make them realize that they all work together. But Deputy Mayor Marks, I think you had something you wanted to say too. And then Sarah, I'll come back to you.
I think it's even bigger than that. And I remember back in 2018 when Duncan McPhail was the warden, and he tried very hard. You know, we had talks with the City of London and the City of St. Thomas, the county as a whole, looking at big picture things. When someone leaves London and drives to Port Stanley, they really don't care how many municipalities they go through. They just like to have good roads, good service, and hassle-free. And you know, our municipal boundaries are what they are. But I think we need to good neighbors and work with the city, work with Southwold, et cetera, so that we're looking at big pictures. So the boundaries are what they are, but you know, it was mentioned earlier that the challenges of infrastructure and the high cost of pollution plants, et cetera. Well, maybe they have to be shared. Like we helped out Southwold, and now they're going to get the benefit of growth. And when partnerships, both sides have to benefit equally, and then that's the true benefit of them. And I think that's, you know, like I said, Duncan started that, and then along come COVID. And I hope we can continue that. But, you know, I think we need to ignore the boundaries and look for more shared services so that everyone in the whole region benefits.
And I think, Zara, you had something you wanted to say.
No, thank you, Mayor Martin. I was just going to note that it is very common across municipalities in Ontario and across Canada as well, where amalgamation has occurred. And communities, we actually had this conversation at Dillon a few days ago, and Ron can certainly jump in here as well. But we've had that experience of seeing how amalgamation can impact community identity and how look within a larger municipal context, communities do tend to hold on to their individual identities, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. It can actually be a strength in some ways, but then also thinking about how do we foster a sense of overall community spirit and community identity and support for the overarching goals of the municipality versus anything that might constitute rivalry. That's a great point. Thank you. I do believe Councillor Kravitz also has his hand up, so I'll go back to you, Mayor Martin.
Okay, and I see Mr. Shishido has his hand up as well, so I'll let him respond, and then Councillor Kravitz, and then Councillor Fair.
Thank you.
You're muted, Ron.
All right, I do that all the time. Just building on what Zara said, I really believe it's a generational thing.
Yep.
I can say that my father, he always, even though it was City of Toronto, he always said, I live in the township of Etobicoke. And then I still relate to, I'm in Etobicoke. And even sometimes you look at the passports and it says Etobicoke, and various things from the City of Toronto say Etobicoke. But the interesting thing is my son, he relates to, he lives in Toronto. And I think it's wherever you are, whether it's Toronto or Windsor. My mother-in-law, she says she came from the township, and that she still remembers, when the City of Windsor annexed them, they promised this, that, and the next thing. So she still thinks of that. But I want to say that the area has a long history of cooperation between municipalities. And in terms of my time down your way, I was involved when the city and the adjacent municipality came together to facilitate the EDREC complex. And then you look at successive municipalities coming together to facilitate boundary changes, land exchanges, sharing of services, and that has, through cooperation between the municipalities, has allowed each of the municipalities to grow, to follow and as Deputy Mayor Mark said, to accommodate growth in their own municipalities, at the same time make provision for growth in the adjacent municipalities. So this provision of sharing, you have a long history of that, and I think that's going to be very important in the future to continue to build on that mentality of sharing.
Thank you. Now, is it do I have Councillor Kravitz and then Councillor Fair, or?
Yeah, my comment is to do with question number 2 that you had there. One of the biggest challenges I think facing Central Elgin in the future is transportation. There has to be some sort of provision in the future to provide a better public transportation system, initiate one that I'm talking particularly in the Port Stanley area. If we're going to look at affordable housing in the future, affordable housing in one realm cannot exist without a public transportation system or better transportation. And also within Ward 4, that's the area surrounding St. Thomas, I think the sharing that even Ron had mentioned, the sharing of public transportation, we should be a little more aggressive in talking to the city to bringing transportation into that area. So transportation is one of the things with growth, I think, that has to come, and we should be planning on some provision for that in the future.
I agree totally, Dennis. I've tried very hard to get Mayor Preston to work with us on that public transit to at least the areas around St. Thomas. But I know the county are also looking at a county-wide concept of public transportation. and that would include Port Stanley and area. Councillor Fair, you had something you wanted to say.
Yes, I'd like to add to what Councillor Wynn said. I think just from my few years' experience on council here and living in Central Elgin for many years, I think our biggest challenge is that we are so fragmented. We had a few years ago, there was discussion, why would we support underground cabling for the lighting in Union? Port Stanley wanted more representation. I'm a good example in Ward 4 where people are saying, what do we benefit by being in Central Elgin when we're so close? In fact, we join on to St. Thomas. Looking at it, and I have not had very many people say, oh yes, I'm Central Elgin and I'm proud that we're in Central Elgin. In fact, I've had more people saying, oh, I'm so shocked, I thought we were St. Thomas. So I think the big challenge is that we are fragmented. We're a bunch of communities, and the communities are very competitive. I know in our area, we say, why do we want to support Belmont for this? Or why do you spend so much time on Port Stanley issues? So I think somehow if Central Elgin is going to go on, it has to somehow draw the community together. So they say, yeah, we are Central Elgin. We're not St. Thomas. We're not just Union. We're not just Port Stanley. But I think that is going to be a big problem. And the competition between these various communities is great.
Thank you, Councillor Rowe.
My comment would be for question number 2 is that we've all heard the growing pains, I guess, excuse me, that we've gone through with the current growth. So managing costs in order to achieve whatever that goal may be is critically important, simply because the population base for the same services that you would need in a much larger urban area are exactly the same, but those costs have to be covered over a smaller population base. So somehow we need to be extremely sensitive to how that all transpires.
I agree. And the one that I would say, even on question 2 there, a lot of the communities such as Port Stanley, like even the new people coming in, like the look and feel of that small old community. And if we allow it to grow larger and larger and larger and larger, you're going to lose that for sure. And a lot of them are very concerned about that. I don't have a lot of concerns about the small little Sparta where I live, because we believe very strongly in serviced, building only out and increasing in serviced areas. So that'll probably stay small. But I think some of our areas, like even giving Belmont a unique, like I agree with Zara in the sense it's not like each community can have its unique things that are important to it. And I think it would be nice to recognize in some way what is unique about each of our communities, what is strong about each of them, each of the areas. And I realize probably the most difficult are the Lyndhurst Eastwood areas because they are so close to St. Thomas. But it is hard. We've tried. I was on 10 when we were 10 years old, and we built a garden out here with 3 sections intersecting Belmont, Port Stanley, and the old Yarmouth Township, trying to get even our gardeners in our communities working together to come up with some ideas. But it is a challenge. But I do think I don't want to lose the character of our communities, because they each have their own unique character. And I think that's going to be a challenge with growth as well, is how do you keep the character that people like so much and the reason they want to come here. Deputy Mayor Marks.
I think we live in a wonderful part of the world. When we get criticized, and we often do, we have the highest water rates and the highest taxes in the world, which I don't believe, and then we generally say, well, it's a huge geographic area, small population base, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then we'll go on, we'll say very little commercial, very little industrial. And that's all true. But after 20 years, I'm kind of getting tired of saying it. And I think now's the time when we look at the corridor between the edge of Central Elgin to Aylmer, that certainly is a potential to grow. The county is growing with the developments of the Ford land. I think obviously we know there's a shortage of housing and it's just getting worse and worse, but there's so much opportunity. And I think we need, if we had more industrial, more commercial, that's going to help our tax base. So we need to be looking at that. Some growth, good solid growth, great jobs. That generally is the first. Someone has a job, then they're able to do things.
Anyone else have any comments on these two questions? Second one, I think I value the fact that we have tremendous variety throughout Central Elgin. I really do value the fact that we have a very strong agricultural component and market gardening and all the different things that we have. Plus we have, little villages that have a real sense of community. We have, as I say, that probably the biggest struggle I would think would be the Lyndhurst. And Lyndhurst has a sense of community, but Eastwood have never had a community association. And maybe even if they had a community association, they would get more of a sense of community there. I think the new park, I've had a lot of people comment on how pleased they are about the park going in. So, and I had one tell me, why are you spending money on a park? I couldn't believe it when I heard that, but. Anyone else have any other comments on questions 2 or 3 that are on the screen? Okay, hearing none, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're more than happy for any members of council to come forward with any other thoughts, anything that occurs to you later on. Please do reach out through the project team or through Mr. Shipway as well. We'll be happy to receive any additional thoughts that you'd like to share with us as we move forward. So I just want to give you a bit of a picture of what the next steps look like. So as Mr. Shipway had mentioned, we do have the stakeholder sessions that we'll be hosting over the course of the fall, and those will be drilling down into topics related to agricultural policy, related to housing affordability, and to the environment and climate change elements, as well as to urban design. And we're hoping to do that through some more kind of in-depth conversations that will lead and yield policy directions that staff can take away and use to actually draft those policies. And so those will then lead us into an open house and an online survey, which we hope to be able to arrange, where we will be able to present some of those draft policy directions and be able to identify what the particular feedback was that we received and how we were able to use it as part of this process, as well as any feedback that does not directly get integrated into the official plan or considered in the official plan, what those other mechanisms might be to consider that feedback, whether it's zoning or community improvement plans or any other tools of planning and policy that can be used to further carry forward those policy directions that will be instituted. And so the final phase will be then to develop the final official plan and the associated reporting, and then to bring that forward to council for adoption before sending it to the county for approval. So that generally gives you a picture of what the rest of our flow looks like, both in the near term as well as to the completion of the project. Any questions there before we kind of wrap up, and I'll hand it back to you, Mayor Martin.
Yeah, just one thing, Zara, that I wonder, the community input, these workshops with stakeholders and open house, the virtual ones, how long is that going to be open for? How long are those available for people?
So we are aiming for the public open house, if not late this year, then very early next year to do that. Any surveys that will take place will be given notice, and we'll try to stay open for at least a 6-week period, if not more. So we will try to keep it open for as long as we can, and try to advertise it. And we would really appreciate the support of members of council to be able to get it out to your constituents and make sure that people are hearing about this process and are able to have their voices heard. Unfortunately, because we are so constrained during COVID to more virtual and online mechanisms, we also need to make sure that we're trying to reach people who don't necessarily gravitate towards those mechanisms or who find them a bit alienating or uncomfortable to use. And so we will be looking at other analog mechanisms via mailouts and such to try and reach as much of a diverse population in Central Elgin as we can.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments before we conclude? Is that everything in your report, Zara?
That is it, yes.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Ron or Zara or Jim or Kevin?
Nicely laid out. Thank you.
Yes, it was very well laid out and we appreciate that, as Councillor Wynn said.
Thank you very much. We very much appreciate all the feedback received, and we'll definitely be taking it forward as we go ahead.
Thank you. I certainly remember my time doing the original official plan and I very much enjoyed it. It was very interesting to see what all, goes into an official plan. So.
Heard about it for 7 years now, so it's exciting to be in it now.
Yes. Okay.
It's great.
All right. Thank you very much. Guess there's nothing else, Mr. Oh, sorry, Mrs. Wilson, you have a motion then? Would you need a mover and seconder? Is this just to adjourn? Is that what it is? Thank you. We'll let Mrs. Wilson read the motion.
Motion reads, Madam Mayor, moved by Deputy Mayor Marks, seconded by Councillor Wynn, that the special meeting of council dated Wednesday, September 29th, 2021, be adjourned at 2:30 p.m.
All in favor? Oh, I guess we have to do a recorded vote. I'm sorry, we have two online.
Thanks, guys.
Councillor Rowe?
Yes.
Councillor Kravitz?
Yes.
Councillor Fair?
Yes,
Need to hear you.
yes, yes, I couldn't unmute.
Councillor Wynn?
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Marks?
Yes.
And Mayor Martin?
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Thank you. We're officially adjourned. Thank you for joining us, and Councillor Fair, I hope things are going well.